In the humid summer of 1876, 41, tobacco workers vanished without a trace from the Beaumont plantation in central Kentucky. No bodies were ever found. No ransom demands were made. The local sheriff's investigation lasted exactly 3 days before being mysteriously closed by order of the county magistrate. For nearly 150 years, the families of Bourbon County have whispered about that scorching July night when an entire work crew simply disappeared from one of Kentucky's most prosperous tobacco estates. The official records state that the workers abandoned their contracts and fled north, but recently discovered letters hidden for generations in the walls of the old Beaumont manor tell a very different story. Before we continue with the story of the Beaumont plantation and uncover what really happened to those 41 souls, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments below, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers across America. What those letters reveal will challenge everything historians thought they knew about labor conditions in post-Civil War Kentucky. The Beaumont plantation stretched across nearly 3,000 acres of Kentucky's fertile bluegrass region, where the limestone-rich soil had made tobacco cultivation a gold mine for generations. Established in 1798 by French immigrant Claude Beaumont, the estate had weathered the Revolution, the War of 1812, and most recently, the devastating changes brought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. By 1876, the plantation was under the management of Claude's grandson, Jeremiah Beaumont, a man known throughout Bourbon County for his shrewd business sense and his ability to adapt to the new economic realities of a post-slavery South. Unlike many plantation owners who had lost everything after emancipation, Jeremiah had successfully transitioned to a contract labor system, offering decent wages and housing to both former slaves and poor white families desperate for steady work. The summer of 1876 promised to be the most profitable in the plantation's history. The tobacco crop was exceptional, with broad, healthy leaves that would fetch premium prices at the Louisville markets. Jeremiah had assembled a diverse workforce of 41 men, women, and teenage children, a mixture of freed slaves who had chosen to stay on the land they knew, Irish immigrants fleeing poverty, and local white families struggling to make ends meet in the economically uncertain times following the war. Among the workers were names that would later haunt the county records. Samuel Ruddled, a former slave who had earned Jeremiah's trust as a field supervisor. Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant whose letters to his sister in Boston painted a picture of hope and steady work. Martha Caldwell, a widow with 3 children who had found refuge and employment at Beaumont after her husband's death in a mining accident. And Thomas Vance, a young white man from the mountains of eastern Kentucky, who had come seeking a better life than the hard-scrabble farming that had claimed his father's health. The plantation operated like a small town. The workers lived in neat rows of wooden cabins behind the main house. Each family allotted a small garden plot for vegetables. Jeremiah had built a general store where workers could purchase necessities, a small schoolhouse where the children learned to read and write, and even a chapel where traveling preachers held services twice a month. To outside observers, Beaumont Plantation represented a success story. A former slave plantation transformed into a thriving agricultural enterprise that provided dignity and opportunity to people from vastly different backgrounds. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, tensions simmered. The summer of 1876 was not just any summer in America. It was the centennial year, a time when the nation was simultaneously celebrating its achievements and grappling with the unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction. In Kentucky, as in much of the South, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan remained active, terrorizing black communities and any whites who dared to work alongside them as equals. The integrated workforce at Beaumont Plantation was an anomaly that drew attention, not all of it welcome. Local newspaper editor Harrison Crow had written several editorials questioning the social experiment at Beaumont, arguing that such integration was unnatural and dangerous to the established order. Several neighboring plantation owners, still bitter about their losses during the war, viewed Jeremiah's success with a mixture of envy and resentment. There were rumors of nighttime meetings, of hooded riders seen on the roads near the plantation, of threats whispered in the darkness. July 23, 1876, started like any other summer day at Beaumont Plantation. The workers rose before dawn to beat the crushing Kentucky heat, gathering their tools and heading to the tobacco fields as the first pale light crept across the rolling hills. The air was thick with humidity and the sweet, pungent smell of ripening tobacco leaves. Mockingbirds called from the oak trees that dotted the landscape, their songs mixing with the low conversations of the workers as they began another day of the harvest that would determine their prosperity for the coming year. Samuel Ruddled, the field supervisor, had assigned the crews to different sections of the plantation that morning. The main group of 28 workers was sent to the eastern fields, where the tobacco plants were at their peak and needed immediate attention. 13 others were assigned to the curing barns, where the delicate process of drying and preparing the already harvested leaves required constant monitoring. By 7 in the morning, all 41 workers were accounted for and at their posts. Jeremiah Beaumont made his usual morning rounds, riding his bay air through the fields and stopping to speak with various crew leaders about the day's tasks. Several workers later recalled that he seemed particularly pleased with the quality of the crop and had mentioned plans to expand operations the following year. "This harvest will set us up for years to come," he told Samuel Ruddled as they examined a particularly fine section of tobacco plants. "Every family here will see good money from this season." As the day progressed, the oppressive heat drove temperatures well above 90. The workers moved methodically through the rows of tobacco, cutting the mature plants and loading them onto wooden wagons for transport to the curing barns. Martha Caldwell was overheard joking with her fellow workers about how the sweat running down their faces would season the tobacco leaves. Patrick O'Sullivan sang Irish ballads to keep the work crew's spirits up as they labored under the blazing sun. At noon, the plantation bell rang for the midday meal, and all 41 workers gathered in the shade of the large oak trees near the main house. They shared simple fare, cornbread, beans, and cold buttermilk. While discussing the morning's progress, several workers mentioned strange visitors they had seen on the plantation roads earlier that week, well-dressed men in dark suits, who had ridden through without stopping to speak with anyone. Samuel Ruddled had assumed they were potential tobacco buyers scouting the operation, but something about their demeanor had made him uneasy. After the meal, work resumed. The afternoon shift focused on the more delicate tasks of selecting and preparing the finest tobacco leaves for premium market grades. The workers labored until sunset, when the plantation bell rang again to signal the end of the workday. As had been the custom for months, all 41 workers gathered at the general store to collect their daily wages. Jeremiah Beaumont believed in paying his workers at the end of each day rather than waiting for weekly payouts, a practice that had earned him considerable loyalty. Thomas Vance, who kept meticulous records of the daily wage distributions, noted in his journal that evening that every worker had been present and accounted for at 6:30 when the last wages were handed out. The workers then dispersed to their cabins for supper and rest, many gathering on their front porches to enjoy the cooling evening air and share stories of the day. But something happened in the darkness between sunset and sunrise, something that would turn a prosperous Kentucky plantation into the center of one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. When Jeremiah Beaumont rang the morning bell at 5:30 on July 24th, no one came. The cabins that had housed 41 people the night before stood empty, their doors hanging open. Their occupants vanished without a trace. Personal belongings remained, scattered on tables and beds, half-finished meals, children's toys, letters waiting to be mailed. But of the 41 men, women, and children who had worked the tobacco fields just hours before, there was no sign. The disappearance sent shockwaves through Bourbon County. Jeremiah Beaumont immediately rode to the county seat in Paris, Kentucky, to report the mass vanishing to Sheriff William Danvers. The sheriff, a gruff Civil War veteran who had seen his share of violence and chaos, initially dismissed the report as mass desertion. Workers abandon contracts all the time, he told Beaumont, especially when harvest season ends and they think they can find better wages elsewhere. But Beaumont pressed the sheriff to investigate. The harvest was far from over. The workers would have forfeited weeks of premium wages by leaving at that moment. More troubling were the personal effects left behind. Martha Caldwell's life savings, nearly $40 in gold coins, remained in a coffee tin under her bed. Patrick O'Sullivan's precious letters from his sister in Boston, his only connection to family, lay scattered on his cabin floor. Children's Sunday clothes, carefully mended and preserved for church services, hung on pegs, as if their owners had simply stepped outside for a moment. Sheriff Danvers assembled a small search party and spent 3 days combing the plantation grounds and the surrounding countryside. They found curious evidence that raised more questions than it answered. Horse tracks suggested that multiple riders had visited the plantation during the night of July 23rd, but the tracks were deliberately obscured and impossible to follow beyond the main road. Several workers' cabins showed signs of hasty departure, overturned chairs, scattered belongings, but others appeared to have been left in normal order, as if their occupants had simply vanished from their beds. Most disturbing were the discoveries in the tobacco fields themselves. The workers had left their tools exactly where they had been working, arranged in neat rows, as was their habit. But someone had come through after their disappearance and systematically destroyed approximately 3 acres of the finest tobacco plants, cutting them down and burning them in small piles throughout the eastern fields. The destruction seemed purposeful, rather than random, targeting the most valuable sections of the crop. On July 27th, just as Sheriff Danvers was expanding his investigation to include neighboring counties, he received an unexpected visit from County Magistrate Edmund Hartwell. Hartwell, a wealthy landowner with political connections throughout Kentucky, informed the sheriff that the investigation was to be immediately closed. The official record would state that the 41 workers had violated their contracts and fled north, possibly to find work in the growing industrial cities of Ohio and Indiana. When Sheriff Danvers protested that the evidence suggested something far more sinister, Magistrate Hartwell produced a stack of legal documents. Someone, he would not say who, had come forward with information proving that the missing workers had been involved in illegal activities. The details were sealed by court order, but Hartwell assured the sheriff that closing the investigation was in the best interest of everyone involved. Any further inquiry would only bring unwanted attention to Bourbon County and potentially damage the region's reputation and economic prospects. Jeremiah Beaumont was devastated by both the loss of his workers and the abrupt end of the investigation. He spent his own money hiring private investigators from Louisville, but they found no trace of the missing people. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, famous for their thoroughness, sent to agents who spent weeks following leads throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Their final report, filed in September 1876, concluded that 41 people could not simply vanish without leaving some trace, unless extraordinary measures were taken to ensure their disappearance. As the months passed, the abandoned cabins at Beaumont Plantation began to decay. Jeremiah could not bring himself to hire new workers to live in the homes of the vanished, and the tobacco operation that had once been the pride of Bourbon County fell into decline. Local families whispered theories about what had happened. Some believed the workers had been murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for daring to work as equals across racial lines. Others suspected they had been kidnapped and sold into illegal bondage in remote mining operations. A few wondered if they had witnessed something they shouldn't have and been eliminated to protect powerful interests. The mystery deepened in 1879 when a drifter passing through Bourbon County claimed to have seen Martha Caldwell in a Memphis boarding house. He described her perfectly, including the distinctive scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. When authorities investigated, they found that a woman matching her description had indeed stayed at the boarding house for 3 days in June 1879, but had left no name and paid her bill in gold coins. The boarding house keeper remembered her asking repeatedly about safe passage to Mexico, but she had disappeared one morning without explanation. This single unverified sighting was the only potential trace of any of the 41 missing workers ever reported. As the years passed and no other evidence emerged, the story of the Beaumont plantation workers became a local legend, told and retold around kitchen tables and in country stores throughout central Kentucky. The truth about what happened to the 41 workers might have remained buried forever, if not for the curiosity of Margaret Beaumont, Jeremiah's great niece, who inherited the decaying plantation house in 1923. Margaret, a schoolteacher from Louisville with a passion for family history, was determined to restore the mansion and uncover the full story of her family's mysterious legacy. As she worked to renovate the house, Margaret made a series of discoveries that gradually unveiled a conspiracy far more complex and sinister than anyone had imagined. While removing water-damaged wallpaper from Jeremiah's former study, she found a collection of letters that had been carefully sealed inside the walls, correspondence that Jeremiah had apparently hidden shortly before his own death in 1881. The letters revealed that the troubles at Beaumont Plantation had begun months before the workers' disappearance. Starting in early 1876, Jeremiah had received increasingly threatening messages from a group calling itself the Kentucky Brotherhood, a secretive organization apparently composed of wealthy landowners, politicians, and businessmen who opposed the integration and economic success of operations like Beaumont Plantation. One letter dated May 15, 1876 was particularly chilling. Mr. Beaumont, your social experiment has gone too far. The mixing of races and positions of equality is an abomination that threatens the natural order of our society. You have been warned before, but you continue to flaunt your disrespect for Southern tradition. The Brotherhood has voted. You will cease these activities immediately, or face consequences that will serve as a warning to others who might follow your misguided example. Another letter from June 1876 was even more explicit. Your workers have been observed attending integrated social gatherings, and your operation has become a beacon for radical elements seeking to undermine our way of life. Dissolve your workforce immediately and adopt proper labor practices, or the Brotherhood will take action to protect the interests of this county. Do not mistake this for an idle threat. Margaret found evidence that Jeremiah had taken these threats seriously. He had written to the governor of Kentucky requesting protection, but his letter had apparently been intercepted or ignored. He had also contacted the federal authorities in Louisville, but post-instruction enforcement of civil rights had become increasingly lax, and federal interest in protecting integrated workforces had waned considerably by 1876. Most revealing was a letter Jeremiah had written to his brother in Virginia, dated just 2 days before the disappearance. Thomas, I fear I have made a terrible mistake. My attempts to build something good and decent have attracted the attention of men who will stop at nothing to maintain their vision of how things should be. I have tried to protect my workers, but I may have only made them targets. If something happens to me or to them, look for answers among the men who meet in the basement of the Hartwell House on the 3rd Thursday of each month. They call themselves patriots, but they are something far darker. This reference to County Magistrate Edmund Hartwell, the same man who had ordered the investigation closed, sent Margaret searching through county records for additional evidence. What she found was a pattern of suspicious activity that had been carefully concealed for decades. In the months following the Beaumont disappearances, several other integrated work operations throughout central Kentucky had experienced similar problems. Workers had been intimidated, buildings had been burned, and contracts had been mysteriously canceled. The perpetrators were never identified, but county records showed that in each case, the investigation had been quickly closed by order of local magistrates. More disturbing was Margaret's discovery that several of the men she suspected of involvement in the Kentucky Brotherhood had grown conspicuously wealthy in the late 1870s. Despite the economic depression that had affected most of the region, Edmund Hartwell, in particular, had purchased 3 additional plantations between 1877 and 1880, expanding his holdings by nearly 10,000 acres at a time when most landowners were struggling to maintain their existing properties. Investigation took on new urgency when she discovered a coded ledger hidden beneath the floorboards of Jeremiah's bedroom. The ledger contained detailed records of meetings, names, and financial transactions that painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal organization that had operated throughout Kentucky for years. The codes were complex, but Margaret's background as a school teacher helped her recognize patterns and eventually decipher much of the content. The ledger revealed that the Kentucky Brotherhood was far more than a local hate group. It was a criminal enterprise that used intimidation and violence to eliminate competition and seize valuable properties throughout the region. Integrated operations like Beaumont Plantation were targeted not just for ideological reasons but because their success threatened the economic dominance of Brotherhood members who relied on cheap, exploited labor to maintain their profits. Margaret's investigation had attracted attention, the wrong kind of attention. In late 1924, she began receiving anonymous warnings to abandon her research into the plantation's history. Someone broke into her Louisville apartment and searched through her papers, though nothing was stolen. Her mail was apparently being intercepted as several letters from historical societies and researchers who had offered to help with her investigation never reached her. The harassment escalated when Margaret hired a private investigator to help trace the surviving families of the missing workers. The investigator, a former Louisville police detective named Robert Hayes, had made significant progress in tracking down descendants of several workers when he was found dead in his office, apparently from a heart attack. However, his files related to the Beaumont case had been removed, and his secretary reported that 2 well-dressed men had visited the office the day before his death, claiming to represent interested parties who wanted the investigation stopped. Despite these warnings, Margaret pressed forward with her research, driven by a growing conviction that the 41 workers had not simply disappeared, they had been murdered, and their deaths had been covered up by some of the most powerful men in Kentucky. Her breakthrough came when she located Ezra O'Sullivan, the elderly nephew of Patrick O'Sullivan, one of the missing workers. Ezra, now living in Boston, had preserved his uncle's letters and had spent decades searching for information about Patrick's fate. He revealed to Margaret that Patrick's final letter, dated July 20, 1876, had contained disturbing information about tensions at the plantation. "Dear Mary, something evil is brewing here in Kentucky. Samuel Ruddled, the field supervisor, told me yesterday that men have been watching the plantation at night, sitting on horses just beyond the Tarrant. Mr. Beaumont has been nervous and short-tempered, which is not like him. Some of the workers are talking about leaving, but the harvest is so close to completion that most of us want to see it through. The money will set our families up for the winter and beyond, but I have a feeling in my bones that something terrible is going to happen. If you do not hear from me soon, contact the authorities in Boston and tell them that Patrick O'Sullivan did not abandon his job willingly." This letter provided the first direct evidence that the workers had sensed danger before their disappearance. But Ezra had even more shocking information to share. In 1891, 15 years after the disappearance, he had received a visit from a stranger who claimed to have information about Patrick's fate. The man, who would not give his name, told Ezra that Patrick and the others had been killed on the night of July 23, 1876, and their bodies disposed of in a way that would ensure they were never found. The stranger claimed to have been present during the killings, but said he had been bound by oath never to reveal the details. However, guilt had tormented him for 15 years, and he wanted Patrick's family to know that their loved one had died bravely, trying to protect the women and children in the group. Before disappearing again, the stranger left Ezra with a cryptic clue. If you want to find where they rest, look for the place where the tobacco grows tallest, where the soil is richest, where the limestone runs deepest. Margaret realized that this clue might refer to a specific location on the Beaumont Plantation. Kentucky's limestone-rich soil was famous for producing exceptional tobacco, but certain areas were known to be particularly fertile. She returned to the plantation with a team of agricultural experts and began testing soil composition throughout the property. Their investigation led them to a section of the eastern fields where the tobacco had historically grown with unusual vigor, the same area where the mysterious crop destruction had occurred immediately after the workers' disappearance. Soil samples from this area showed significantly higher levels of phosphorus and nitrogen than surrounding fields, a composition that could be explained by the decomposition of organic matter deep beneath the surface. Just when Margaret thought she was close to solving the mystery, she received a visit that would change everything. County Magistrate Harrison Hartwell, Edmund Hartwell's son, who had inherited both his father's position and his secrets, arrived at the plantation accompanied by 2 attorneys and a court order. The order signed by a judge in Lexington prohibited any further excavation or disturbance of the plantation grounds, citing historical preservation concerns and respect for private property rights. But Margaret had learned enough to know she was close to the truth. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, revealing a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of Kentucky society. Before she could be stopped, she would uncover evidence that would expose not just what happened to the 41 workers, but why they had to die and who had given the order for their deaths. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Bourbon County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of murder and conspiracy that shook Kentucky to its core. Margaret Beaumont's final breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While being forced to halt her excavation of the plantation grounds, she had befriended Elias Ruddled, the elderly grandson of Samuel Ruddled, the missing field supervisor. Elias, now in his 70s, had grown up hearing whispered stories about his grandfather's fate from older family members who had been too frightened to speak openly about what they suspected. The old man's hands trembled as he sat across from Margaret in her modest hotel room in Paris, Kentucky. On that cold December evening in 1924, outside, snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the small town and creating an atmosphere of isolation that seemed appropriate for the terrible secrets he was about to reveal. For nearly an hour, Elias had sat in silence, wrestling with a decision that would break a promise his family had kept for almost 50 years. "Miss Beaumont," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are some burdens that get heavier with time, not lighter. My grandmother made me swear on the Bible that I would never tell what she saw that night. But I'm 73 years old, and I can't take this secret to my grave, knowing that my grandfather and all those good people are lying in unmarked dirt while their killers' families live in mansions built on blood money." As Elias began his story, Margaret realized that everything she had discovered so far was just the surface of a conspiracy, far more elaborate and horrifying than she had imagined. His grandmother, Samuel's wife, Rebecca, had not been at the plantation on the night of July 23, 1876. She had been in Lexington caring for her sister Martha, who was dying of consumption. This absence, which had probably saved her life, had also made her the only witness to the immediate aftermath of what would become known as the Beaumont massacre. Rebecca had returned to the plantation on the morning of July 24th, expecting to find her husband and the other workers beginning another day of harvest. Instead, she had found an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. The workers' cabin stood empty, doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Children's toys lay scattered in the dirt, and the morning meal preparations had been abandoned mid-task. Pots of grits still sat over cold fires, and coffee grounds were spilled across kitchen tables, as if people had been interrupted in the middle of their morning routines. But Rebecca was not just any worker's wife. She had been born into slavery on a Virginia plantation, and had developed the survival instincts that had kept her alive through the horrors of bondage and the chaos of the Civil War. When she sensed danger, she knew to hide first and investigate later. Instead of calling out for her husband or approaching the main house, she had concealed herself in the dense woods that bordered the eastern fields and waited to see what would reveal itself. What she witnessed over the next several hours would haunt her for the rest of her life. As the sun climbed higher, bringing the oppressive heat that was typical of Kentucky summers, Rebecca saw wagons emerging from the eastern fields, not the usual tobacco wagons, but heavy freight wagons with reinforced beds and canvas covers. The wagons were driven by men she didn't recognize, but accompanying them on horseback were several figures she knew all too well. County Magistrate Edmund Hartwell rode at the front of the procession, his usually immaculate clothing stained with what looked like dirt and something darker. Behind him came Judge Cornelius Vandenberg from the county courthouse, Mayor Samuel Preston from the town of Paris, and Dr. Hiram Caldwell. Ironically, no relation to the missing Martha Caldwell, but the county's most respected physician and a man Rebecca had always trusted. Seeing these pillars of the community involved in whatever had happened to the workers filled her with a terror beyond anything she had experienced even during the darkest days of slavery. The procession moved slowly toward the main road, and Rebecca counted at least 8 wagons, all heavily loaded and covered. The men riding alongside spoke in low, urgent tones, but the summer air carried fragments of their conversation to her hiding place. She heard references to the northern route, the arrangements in Louisville, and most chillingly making sure there are no traces left behind. But Rebecca's nightmare was far from over. After the wagons disappeared down the main road, another group of men arrived at the plantation. These were not the respectable community leaders she had recognized earlier, but rough-looking individuals who moved with the purposeful efficiency of men accustomed to violence. They immediately began a systematic destruction of evidence that revealed the premeditated nature of what had occurred. The men went through each abandoned cabin methodically, removing anything that might identify the missing workers or provide clues about their fate. Personal letters were gathered and burned in a large fire behind the main house. Clothing and personal effects were loaded onto smaller wagons and hauled away. Most disturbing of all, the men brought buckets of some chemical substance. Later, Rebecca would realize it was lime and scattered it throughout the cabins and surrounding areas, presumably to destroy any biological evidence that might remain. As Rebecca watched this systematic eraser of 41 human lives, she began to understand that she was witnessing not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned operation that had been organized well in advance. The men worked with military precision, following what was clearly a predetermined plan. They knew exactly where to look for important documents, which areas to treat with chemicals, and how to eliminate any trace that the workers had ever existed. The most horrifying moment came when Rebecca saw several of the men return from the eastern fields, carrying bloodied tools and clothing. They fed these items into the fire behind the main house, and the acrid smell of burning fabric and something else, something organic and terrible, drifted through the humid air to her hiding place. It was then that Rebecca fully understood that, Her husband and all the other workers were dead, and that their bodies had been disposed of somewhere in those eastern fields. But the nightmare still wasn't over. As the afternoon wore on, Rebecca watched as the conspirators began the next phase of their plan, creating a false narrative to explain the workers' disappearance. Jeremiah Beaumont himself arrived at the plantation around 3 o'clock, riding hard from the direction of Paris. From his behavior, it was clear that he had no idea what had transpired. His shock and horror upon discovering the empty cabins seemed genuine, and Rebecca watched as he frantically searched for any sign of his workers. What happened next revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Magistrate Hartwell approached Jeremiah with what appeared to be a prepared explanation. Rebecca couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she caught enough fragments to understand that Hartwell was telling Jeremiah that the workers had been threatened by local vigilantes and had fled during the night for their own safety. Hartwell produced documents that he claimed proved the workers had violated their contracts and abandoned their jobs. Jeremiah's anguished protests were met with calm assurances from Hartwell that everything possible would be done to locate the missing workers. But Rebecca could see what Jeremiah could not: the subtle signals being exchanged between Hartwell and the other men, the way they positioned themselves to control the conversation, the practiced manner in which they redirected Jeremiah's questions and concerns. As evening approached, Rebecca realized that she was in mortal danger. If the conspirators discovered that anyone had witnessed their activities, they would not hesitate to eliminate that witness. She began to carefully work her way deeper into the woods, planning to remain hidden until she could safely leave the area. But as she moved through the underbrush, she overheard a conversation that revealed the full horror of what she had witnessed. Two of the ruffle-looking men were standing near the edge of the woods, smoking and discussing the day's events. One was complaining about the physical difficulty of the work they had done in the eastern fields. The other responded with casual brutality that made Rebecca's blood run cold. 41 bodies don't bury themselves, especially when you got to dig deep enough that they won't ever be found. But the pay is good. And the boss says this kind of work keeps the colored folks and their white sympathizers in line. Nothing like a whole crew disappearing to make people think twice about getting too uppity. The first man chuckled and replied, "The line will take care of any evidence, and by next spring, this will be the most fertile tobacco ground in Kentucky." Fitting, isn't it? The ones who thought they were too good to know their place will end up fertilizing the crops that make their bedbetters rich. This conversation confirmed Rebecca's worst fears about her husband's fate, but it also provided crucial information about the location of the mass grave, the eastern fields, where the conspirators had spent the day working, where the tobacco had always grown with unusual vigor. This was where Samuel and the others had been buried. Rebecca waited in the woods until well after midnight before beginning her careful journey away from the plantation. She didn't dare return to her cabin to collect her belongings, knowing that the conspirators might be watching for anyone who tried to claim the workers' possessions. Instead, she made her way on foot to Lexington, where her dying sister provided cover for her presence in the area. But Rebecca's ordeal was far from over. In the days that followed, she learned that the conspiracy extended far beyond what she had witnessed at the plantation. When Sheriff Danvers began his investigation, Rebecca considered coming forward with what she had seen. But before she could make contact with the sheriff, she received a visit from two men who identified themselves as friends who wanted to make sure she understood the importance of remaining silent about recent events. The men never explicitly threatened her, but their message was clear. They knew who she was. They knew what she had seen, and they were watching her. They suggested that she might want to consider leaving Kentucky permanently, perhaps joining the many former slaves who were migrating north in search of better opportunities. They even offered to provide her with money for travel expenses, making it clear that this was not generosity, but payment for her silence. Terrified for her life, and realizing that the conspiracy included people with the power to reach her anywhere. In Kentucky, Rebecca made the agonizing decision to remain silent. She used the travel money to relocate to Cincinnati, where she found work as a domestic servant and tried to build a new life. But she never forgot what she had witnessed, and she never forgave herself for not finding a way to seek justice for her husband and the other victims. Years later, when she felt it was safe to return to Kentucky, Rebecca began the careful process of documenting what she had seen. She wrote detailed accounts of the events, created maps showing the location of the mass grave, and compiled a list of everyone she had recognized among the conspirators. She hid these records carefully, knowing that they might be the only evidence that would ever exist of the Beaumont massacre. When Rebecca finally told her son about what she had witnessed, she made him promise that the information would be passed down through the family until it was safe to reveal the truth. She died in 1902, taking her secrets with her, but leaving behind a legacy of evidence that would eventually help expose one of the most heinous crimes in Kentucky history. Now, in 1924, Elias Ruddled was breaking his grandmother's trust and his family's silence because he had come to understand that some promises are meant to be broken when they serve to protect evil. As he finished telling Rebecca's story to Margaret Beaumont, tears streamed down his weathered face. "Miss Beaumont," he said, "Ma spent her whole life carrying the weight of what she saw. She died believing that justice would never come from my grandfather and the others. But maybe if we're brave enough to speak the truth now, we can finally give them some peace." Margaret realized that Rebecca's testimony was the missing piece that would allow her to understand not just what had happened to the 41 workers, but how the conspiracy had been organized and covered up. But Elias had more evidence to share. Hidden in the basement of his small house was Rebecca's carefully preserved documentation, maps, lists of names, detailed timelines, and most importantly, a diagram showing the exact location where she had seen the conspirators returning from their grisly work in the eastern fields. The evidence Rebecca had compiled over the years painted a picture of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the local level. The Kentucky Brotherhood, as they called themselves, was part of a regional network of terrorist organizations that had formed in response to the social and economic changes brought by Reconstruction. These groups operated with the knowledge and protection of politicians, judges, and business leaders who shared their commitment to maintaining white supremacy and economic exploitation. The decision to eliminate the Beaumont plantation workers had been made at a meeting in Louisville in May 1876, attended by representatives from brotherhood chapters throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. The integrated workforce at Beaumont was seen as a dangerous example that might inspire similar experiments elsewhere. If such operations could succeed, it would prove that the South could prosper without maintaining the racial oppression and exploitative labor practices that benefited the Brotherhood's members. The massacre had been planned with military precision. The timing was carefully chosen to coincide with the height of harvest season, when the workers would be most reluctant to leave, and when their disappearance would cause maximum economic damage to Jeremiah Beaumont. The location was selected because the eastern field's remote position would allow the conspirators to work without being observed from the main house or the nearby road. Most chilling of all, Rebecca's records revealed that the Beaumont massacre was not an isolated incident. The Kentucky Brotherhood had been responsible for similar operations throughout the region, targeting integrated workforces, Republican politicians, civil rights activists, and anyone who challenged the Poster Instructions social order. The group maintained detailed records of their activities, treating terrorism and murder as simply another form of business enterprise. Armed with this evidence, Margaret finally understood why her investigation had drawn such intense opposition. The descendants and successors of the original Brotherhood members still held positions of power throughout Kentucky, and they were determined to prevent the exposure of their ancestors' crimes. The conspiracy had been passed down through generations, maintaining its secrecy through intimidation, corruption, and the careful placement of sympathizers in positions of authority. But Margaret also realized that she now possessed evidence that could finally bring justice for the 41 murdered workers. Rebecca's documentation provided not just proof of what had happened, but the names of those responsible and the location of their unmarked grave. For the first time in nearly 50 years, there was hope that the truth about the Beaumont massacre would finally be revealed. Armed with Rebecca Ruddle's explosive testimony and documentation, Margaret Beaumont faced the most dangerous moment of her investigation. She now possessed evidence that could expose a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for nearly half a century. But she also knew that the same forces that had silenced Rebecca and murdered Robert Hayes would not hesitate to eliminate her if they discovered what she had learned. Margaret's first priority was ensuring the survival of the evidence. Working in secret during the harsh winter of 1924-25, she created multiple copies of all of Rebecca's documentation and her own research findings. She used her connections as a school teacher to distribute these copies to trusted contacts throughout the country, historical societies in Boston and Chicago, civil rights organizations in New York and Philadelphia, and journalists in cities far from Kentucky, where local pressure could not reach them. But Margaret also understood that simply releasing the evidence would not guarantee justice. The Kentucky Brotherhood had survived for 50 years by controlling the very institutions that should have brought them to justice. Local law enforcement, county magistrates, and state politicians had either been corrupted or intimidated into silence. If the truth was going to emerge, it would require a more sophisticated strategy than simply presenting evidence to authorities who might be part of the conspiracy themselves. Margaret's breakthrough came when she made contact with federal investigators, who had been quietly building a case against organized terrorist groups throughout the South. The federal government's interest in such organizations had waned considerably since the end of Reconstruction, but a small group of Justice Department officials remained committed to prosecuting crimes that local authorities refused to address. Special Agent Franklin Morrison, based in the Justice Department's Louisville office, had been investigating reports of organized violence against African Americans and their white allies throughout Kentucky for several years. When Margaret approached him with Rebecca's evidence, Morrison realized that she had uncovered documentation of criminal activity that extended far beyond anything his office had previously been able to prove. Morrison's investigation revealed that the Kentucky Brotherhood was indeed part of a much larger network. Similar organizations operated throughout the South, using terrorism and murder to maintain systems of racial and economic oppression. These groups had evolved from the earlier Ku Klux Klan, but operated with greater sophistication and deeper political connections. They maintained careful records of their activities, treating violence as a business enterprise that required the same level of organization and planning as any other commercial venture. The federal investigation into the Brotherhood took over 2 years to complete. Working in coordination with investigators from other states, Morrison's team gradually built a comprehensive picture of the organization's structure, membership, and criminal activities. They discovered that the group had been responsible for hundreds of murders, thousands of acts of intimidation, and systematic corruption of legal and political institutions throughout the region. The Beaumont massacre emerged as one of the most thoroughly documented crimes in the Brotherhood's history. Thanks to Rebecca's careful record-keeping and Margaret's persistent investigation, the evidence was so comprehensive that it provided federal prosecutors with their strongest case against the surviving members of the conspiracy. The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. In 1926, federal grand juries in Louisville, Lexington, and Frankfort returned indictments against 47 individuals connected to the Kentucky Brotherhood, including several sitting judges, county officials, and business leaders. The charges ranged from conspiracy to commit murder to violations of federal civil rights laws. The trials that began in 1927 created a sensation throughout Kentucky and the nation. For the first time, The full extent of poster-instruction terrorism was exposed in open court, with detailed testimony about organized violence that had been hidden for decades. The proceedings revealed not just the specific details of the Beaumont massacre, but the broader system of terror that had been used to maintain white supremacy throughout the South. County Magistrate Harrison Hartwell, facing overwhelming evidence of his father's role in organizing the massacre, chose to cooperate with federal prosecutors rather than face trial. His testimony provided crucial details about the Brotherhood's structure and operations, confirming much of what Rebecca had documented and revealing additional crimes that had never been investigated. Hartwell's confession was both devastating and cathartic. He described how his father had received orders from Brotherhood leaders in Louisville to eliminate the Beaumont workers as an example to other integrated operations throughout the region. The massacre had been planned months in advance, with detailed consideration given to timing, logistics, and cover-up procedures. The conspirators had even prepared legal documents in advance to explain the workers' disappearance and prevent serious investigation. Most shocking was Hartwell's revelation that the Brotherhood had maintained detailed financial records of their criminal activities. Murder and intimidation were treated as business expenses with careful accounting of costs and benefits. The elimination of the Beaumont workers was seen as a profitable investment that would discourage similar integrated operations and preserve the Brotherhood's economic advantages. The trials also revealed the extent to which the conspiracy had corrupted Kentucky's legal and political systems. Several judges had dismissed cases against Brotherhood members without cause. Sheriffs had refused to investigate obvious crimes, and politicians had blocked legislation that might have interfered with the group's activities. The conspiracy had operated with virtual impunity because it controlled the very institutions that should have stopped it. As the legal proceedings continued, Margaret worked with federal authorities to locate and properly bury the remains of the 41 murdered workers. Using Rebecca's maps and additional investigation, archaeologists located the mass grave in the eastern fields of the old Beaumont Plantation. The discovery confirmed the most horrific details of Rebecca's testimony. The workers had indeed been buried in a carefully prepared site designed to ensure their bodies would never be found. The excavation of the mass grave was conducted with the dignity and respect that had been denied to the victims in death. Each set of remains was carefully documented and where possible identified through personal effects or dental records. The workers were finally given proper burials in a cemetery in Paris, Kentucky, with headstones bearing their names and a monument commemorating their sacrifice. The memorial service held for the 41 workers drew hundreds of attendees from throughout Kentucky and beyond. Family members who had never known what happened to their ancestors finally had answers and closure. Civil rights leaders spoke about the broader significance of the massacre and the importance of confronting historical injustices. Margaret Beaumont was recognized for her courage in uncovering the truth, but she deflected credit to Rebecca and the other family members who had preserved the evidence at great personal risk. The federal trials resulted in convictions for 31 of the 47 defendants. Sentences ranged from 10 years to life in prison, with the harshest punishments reserved for those who had directly participated in the murders. Several defendants died before trial, and others fled the state to avoid prosecution. The Kentucky Brotherhood was effectively destroyed as an organization, though individual members who escaped prosecution continued to hold positions of influence throughout the region. The exposure of the Beaumont massacre had broader implications beyond the specific criminal prosecutions. The case became a catalyst for renewed federal attention to organized terrorism in the South and led to the passage of stronger civil rights legislation. It also inspired similar investigations in other states, resulting in the exposure of comparable conspiracies and the prosecution of additional terrorist organizations. Margaret Beaumont devoted the remainder of her life to ensuring that the Victims of the massacre were not forgotten, and that the lessons of their sacrifice were preserved for future generations. She established the Beaumont Memorial Foundation, which provided scholarships for the descendants of the murdered workers and supported research into other instances of organized violence during the post-instruction period. The foundation, also, worked to preserve the historical record of the massacre and its aftermath. Margaret compiled a comprehensive archive of documents, testimony, and evidence related to the case, creating a resource that historians and researchers continue to use today. She insisted that the archive include not just the facts of the conspiracy, but the personal stories of the victims and the impact of their deaths on their families and communities. Margaret's work extended beyond documentation to active education and advocacy. She spoke at schools, universities, and community organizations throughout the country, sharing the story of the Beaumont massacre and its significance in American history. She collaborated with other researchers to document similar crimes throughout the South, helping to build a comprehensive picture of organized terrorism during the post-Civil War period. The old Beaumont Plantation was eventually converted into a memorial and educational center dedicated to the history of labor relations and civil rights in Kentucky. The restored workers' cabins serve as exhibits that tell the stories of the 41 victims in place, their lives in the broader context of the struggles faced by working people in the post-instruction South. The eastern fields where the workers were buried have been converted into a memorial garden, with walking paths and interpretive markers that explain the significance of the site. The Memorial Center has become an important destination for students, researchers, and visitors interested in understanding this dark chapter of American history. Educational programs connect the story of the Beaumont massacre to broader themes of civil rights, labor organizing, and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. The Center's mission is not just to commemorate the victims, but to ensure that their sacrifice contributes to a better understanding of how organized oppression operates and how it can be resisted. The legacy of the Beaumont massacre extends far beyond the specific events of July 23, 1876. The case represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of organized terrorism during the post-instruction period, providing scholars with unprecedented insight into how conspiracy and corruption were used to maintain systems of oppression. The detailed records, preserved by Rebecca Rutledge and uncovered by Margaret Beaumont, have been used in dozens of academic studies and have helped expose similar crimes throughout the South. But perhaps more importantly, the story demonstrates the power of individual courage in confronting institutional evil. Rebecca Rutledge's decision to document what she witnessed, despite the personal danger involved, preserved evidence that would eventually bring justice for the victims. Margaret Beaumont's determination to uncover the truth, even when faced with intimidation and legal obstacles, ensured that the conspiracy could not remain hidden forever. Their examples show that even the most powerful conspiracies can be exposed when individuals are willing to risk everything for justice. The case also highlights the importance of federal intervention in protecting civil rights when local institutions have been corrupted or intimidated. The Kentucky Brotherhood operated with impunity for decades because it controlled local law enforcement and political structures. Only federal investigation and prosecution could break the conspiracy's hold on power and bring the perpetrators to justice. Today, visitors to the Beaumont Memorial Center can walk through the restored plantation grounds and see exhibits that tell the complete story of the massacre and its aftermath. They can visit the Memorial Garden, where the 41 workers are commemorated, and read their names on the monument that Margaret Beaumont helped design. They can also explore the research archives that contain thousands of documents related to the case and its broader historical significance. But the most powerful aspect of the memorial is the way it connects past and present. The story of the Beaumont massacre is not just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder that the struggle for equality and justice is ongoing, and that ordinary people have the power to make extraordinary changes when they choose to act with courage and determination. The 41 workers who died at Beaumont Plantation believed in the possibility of a better future. A future where people of different backgrounds could work together with dignity and respect, where hard work would be rewarded fairly, and where children could receive education and opportunity, regardless of their parents' race or social status. Their vision was silenced by violence, but their legacy lives on in the ongoing struggle for the justice and equality they died seeking. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that justice was ultimately served? Or do the crimes of the Kentucky Brotherhood represent a failure of our legal system that continues to echo today? How do we ensure that the sacrifice of these 41 workers contributes to a more just and equal society? Leave your comment below and tell us your thoughts on this dark but ultimately inspiring chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that uncover the hidden truths of our past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. These stories matter. They help us understand not just where we've been, but where we're going and how we can build a better future for everyone. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the shadows and light of American history.